Welcome. With you is the developer of the Hackshot game, Muhammad Najjar. So let's begin. Hackshot is an artillery game where the player shoots projectiles to hack files and destroy computer viruses. Hackshot design mixes the following elements: artillery, puzzle, physics, adventure, and sandbox. This mix is not the easiest to make and balance. Thus, the first point we will tackle is how artillery games can become more puzzly. In artillery games, the player shoots a projectile to do something, usually to get some stars or to destroy enemies. Usually, these games will provide a shooting curve, which gives an idea of how the projectile will move. This makes it much easier to guess how the projectile will continue to move afterwards. And in rare cases, it can actually make the player outright know that they will be able to perform certain shots. The curve stops either after reaching a certain length or if the curve collides with an object. That's usually how it is done. However, Hackshot's name is a word play on trick shot, because the game is about doing really cool, seemingly impossible shots that do a lot of things. This raises a big problem, which is that this kind of shots are really hard to even guess. And in addition to that, the game should be more puzzle focused, meaning that it should reward planning and knowledge much more than physical intuition and the ability to guess correctly. The solution, and one of the defining aspects of the game, is that projectile physics are predictable from the player's side. Even after multiple reflections, the curve will show exactly how the projectile will behave. This gives the player the ability to plan and just know if something will work, without the need for a lot of trial and error. That said, this solution poses a design challenge. Since players can now just know, it can become extremely easy and maybe even boring after a while. One way to increase the challenge is to make the required angle more and more precise as the game progresses, and players would have to find that specific, magical angle to do the shot. However, I personally think that there are much more interesting ways of adding some intrigue to it. So, let's talk probability. What is the angle range in the game? The angle range spans from 90 degrees to minus 90 degrees. That's an arc of 180 degrees. And since the smallest step value is 0.01 of an angle, this means that there are 18,000 angle values to choose from. The hook of the game is that players can change the physical and logical behavior of the projectile by mixing and matching different attributes and powers, such as changing the gravity, the bounce, mass, hacking power, and other aspects of their projectile. The total number of possible projectile configurations is just shy of 8,000. Multiplying the number of possible angles with the number of possible projectiles, and it becomes clear that there are just too many possibilities for the player to consider. A question that comes to mind: is this specific to this game? No. In essence, all puzzle games are a balance between high enough probabilities so that players can't just guess their way through, and enough clues for the brain to systematically eliminate and reduce the possibilities until it is narrow enough to reach the solution. This huge number of possibilities can make the game frustrating when not handled well. And depending on the game, it can be commented on by players as being fiddly, clunky, or tedious. To give an example, here, in order for the player to make this shot, they have only one angle value that is viable, and any increase or decrease will not only ruin the shot, but also changes the shot too much to the point where even finding it can be really tedious. Enter a design standard. To counter this possible problem, a design standard was created after playtesting some early builds of the game. This design standard states that intended solutions should be possible in a range of angle values. To apply this to the previous example, this shot should be possible in a range of angles. To achieve that, we will cut the corners in a way that makes the shot possible in a range of angles. Every intended shot in the game is tested against this design standard, and if the range is too narrow, level design changes are made to support a wider range of angles. An important question is, how wide should the range be in order for it to feel good? This question is very specific to each game. In Hackshot, during the level design of the game, the width of the angle range actually changes, depending on some of the following factors. The first one is how far is the level in the game. Later levels usually can get away with slightly smaller ranges, due to players getting used to recognizing the intended surfaces for shots. Number 2. How many modifications does the shot require? Shots that require a combination of 2 or 3 different modifications are usually designed with wider angle ranges, because aiming isn't the point here. Number 3. Logic and environment usage. Shots that require using the environment or certain logic elements usually have wider angle ranges, also because aiming isn't the point here. Unpredictability. Because the game isn't meant to be a pure puzzle game, some sense of unknowing and hoping can inject some of that adventurous feeling to it. Designing some shots to invoke the reaction, "I hope this will work out," can be really exciting. However, it's a risk in this context and should be balanced carefully. Thus, the next section will be about constraining physics to be thinky. Starting with a simple situation, we need to push this yellow virus to hit that wall and fall, while deflecting the ball to pick up this blue file. Testing some shots proves that it's really hard to predict what's gonna happen. We do want some sense of uncertainty, but it should be close enough to be almost predictable, while giving some sense of uncertainty. In order to achieve that, every dynamic object in the game, also known as rigid bodies, should by default have no bounce at all. The result of this will be that pushing any dynamic object, such as viruses, into a surface or a wall will ensure that they will not bounce off of it. This adds a degree of knowing. Even if the trajectory of the virus to reach the wall can differ widely, it will always slide down this wall when it hits it. The second change is to remove friction from the projectile ball completely. With that, the player now knows that if the ball is moving on a surface, it will move all the way across it until it hits something. This adds an additional degree of knowing. Now, we know that if the ball began moving towards the file, it will get it eventually. These two changes also makes it easier to make the shots possible in a wider range of angles. Predictability of the unpredictable. Some aspects in the game can't be accurately predicted just by looking, such as how this box will move when hit, especially when the angle is changed. The results can vary widely in a way that makes it fiddly to get the correct intended behavior. It is true that with time and enough experimentation, players will grow an intuition that helps them to predict the behavior more accurately. However, that could take a while, and we might need to find a less tedious way to introduce this aspect to new players. So, why is predicting the behavior of a simple 2D box so hard? Well, because it is not that simple. This 2D box has 3 degrees of freedom. It can move horizontally along the x-axis, it can move vertically along the y-axis, and it can rotate. When the ball hits the box, if the force goes exactly through the center, the box will only move, following the direction of the impact force. However, if the force doesn't go through the center, that will generate a rotation, and a rotation can completely cause some hard to predict behaviors. In order to simplify this aspect, we can go in 2 routes. The first is to disable the rotation completely, and the second is to use a shape that doesn't have corners, such as a circle or a sphere. Both provide certain advantages and disadvantages to designers. A box with no rotation will always move in the direction of the impacting force, if there is nothing preventing it. This makes it good for designing an intentional chain of physics. Surfaces can be used to control the direction of expected movement. Furthermore, we can actually add bounce back to these objects, because the bounce can be much more predictable and easier to use in design in this case. In this example, the box will bounce in a predictable way after hitting a wall. These design advantages also applies to a circle or a sphere. So, are there any differences between using a box with no rotation or using a circle? The box will provide a consistent reaction when hit on its sides, and this consistency spans along the same edge. And since force is correlated to its reaction in both direction and magnitude, this means that the box is easier to use in situations where push speed should be consistent across a range of angles. While the circle can be hard to use for consistent push speeds in design, it can be used to a great extent to give players a more intuitive choice of deflection shots. In this example, doing a deflection shot of the box is really limited and fiddly. While the circle is more intuitive and kinda more predictable. In conclusion, things to consider when using physics in a puzzle context. the number of possibilities and how that affects freedom, tediousness, and design time. Second, limiting bounce and friction, since they can add a degree of complexity and predictability that is usually hard to rationalize. Number 3, limited certain degrees of freedom, especially rotational ones. Number 4, thinking about what shapes to use for dynamic objects and the advantages and disadvantages of each one. And finally, how to use mass, friction, air drag values and how each one affects the behavior of the object. Thank you for listening.